jobs and so on. But from a moral point of view, I'm feeling personally bad when I have the sense that what I am trying to do not reach my goal. And my goal since the last years has been to translate to the policymakers' research, academic results, has been to build dialogue. And in building this dialogue, the efforts is here and there. I mean, it's a reflexivity exercise, an ongoing one that is a challenge on both sides, because even academics and scholars can be challenged by the policymakers' perspective. But if we don't take the time to have a plain talk on some specific topics that are urgent from a policy point of view, we're failing. And I'm really eager to foster this dialogue, because I believe in it. And if we remain in separated boxes, where is the sense of what we're doing? Also because we are talking about migration, that it is really, really sensitive from a human point of view. I mean, so sorry for being strong on this, but this is really what I believe in.
Before going on, when I will make my contribution in a couple of moments, this will become more clear. What I'm saying is not that the dialogue is not necessary, not useful, is that we shouldn't complain too much if policymakers don't listen to us. Basically, most probably what happens is that we are not being relevant. And no, we have to.
Right. Oh, you're right.
So if despite of that, they found us and we have freedom of expression, well, we cannot complain. This is what I say. But of course, I totally agree on the need, as it will become clear in a moment, very clear.
And we will have more time also in the next round to talk about the practice and how maybe to achieve what you are saying, and the ethics also towards the end. So Iván, if you want to give us your presentation that you prepared, go deeper on the topic.
Thank you, Luisa. I will refer to the elements that you have set up in the framework introduction. But first, let me spend 1 minute on my legitimacy to talk about this. I think it is important. I always like to start from my personal point of view to go to more general issues. Research basically aims to produce knowledge. This is very clear. And the question is, of course, knowledge for what? And just a personal confession, I studied economics and political science later. And my reason to do so was not to make an academic career, was not to get many citations. It was basically to change the world for the better, to improve it. And for that, I need at some point to have some impact on policies, because as a researcher and analyst, you cannot have that. And this is what I have been doing and trying to do for the last 30 years, basically, through research, through training, through consultancy, through think tanks like EuroMed, through other kind of public activities. I started more than 15 years ago in the framework of the EuroMediterranean Partnership. I remember already in 2005, I produced edited book with 35 proposals to engage civil society and bring the Euro-Mediterranean Partnership closer to the citizens. Then on employment, also with the trade unions, we did the first regional employment comparative study in the Mediterranean countries. With the EuroMed, we did a survey on civil society in the Euro-Mediterranean countries, and in the last 10 years I have mainly focused on migration, in particular in the Mediterranean. I started in 2009 precisely coordinating a study for the European Commission on labor markets performance and migration flows in Arab Mediterranean countries. So, and in all these endeavors, I always tried really to package the results of my research and the findings in a way that would be relevant for policymakers. So in this sense, we are fully in agreement with you. Now, why some reflections on preconditions for this nexus to work, the research policy network. I will refer you to the last World Migration Report 2020 of the International Organization of Migration, which has some interesting reflections on particularly this issue. I quote from one of their sections: public policy has been defined as anything a government chooses to do or not to do. And it has basically 4 raw ingredients. On the one hand, this policy making, evidence, funding, public sector capability, and political dynamics. It is, of course, only in the field of evidence production where research comes in, and we have to be very clear about it. So, first condition for this nexus to work is that research produces policy-relevant evidence. This is a raw ingredient of policy making, and if this is not achieved, then this nexus will not work. And this will be the failure of researchers, not the failure necessarily of policymakers. Second issue, and this is very relevant in the Euro-Mediterranean context, a government is needed. Anything that the government chooses to do or not to do as a definition of policy, a government is required. Now, in the Euro-Mediterranean context, we don't have a government. The Euro-Mediterranean space is not a polis, it is not a political space. Actually, it is a very much European created structure. And I put to you a question: when we talk about the Mediterranean research policy nexus, where is the government? Which government are we addressing to? Mainly the European Union. And we have to be clear about this. Also, just not to deceive ourselves about the nature of the research policy nexus in the Mediterranean on migration issues. Very important. Then another question, in my opinion, that is crucial to understand this nexus is that setting the objectives of the policy making is a political task, not a research task. So in this research policy nexus, by definition, research is subordinated. The client is policy making. So research can, of course, contribute to policy making through answering some questions like how to reach the objectives of policy, whether policies are effective or not, whether they are working, what is missing to reach those objectives, evaluation activities, or analyze contextual factors influencing in policy implementation and achievement of objectives. But the definition of the priorities and the objectives is a task of policymakers. And it is, in my opinion, important to have clarity about this, just to avoid some confusions, and to admit that in this nexus, researchers, even if we don't like, are subordinate. And this doesn't mean that they are not independent. Only to the extent that they are independent, they will be useful as in feeding the policy-making process. What is the substance of this research policy nexus? Well, first, objectives are very different between researchers and policymakers. As I mentioned before, researchers genuinely want to expand the frontiers of knowledge. I remember a public debate in Brussels on the labor market integration of refugees, of Syrian refugees in European labor markets. And of course, our research-based approach was very much to support the integration of refugees into the labor market in different European countries. And we had Rita Süssmuth, a high-standing German politician, former president of the parliament in Germany during the unification, so quite important one, and former Ministry of Health, by the way. And she said, I totally agree. She gave a very, very, I would say, enlightened speech. But you, my friend, and she was referring to me, you don't know how difficult it is to win election. At the end. And for me, this is very important because the objectives, for me, I can afford as researcher to say, no, the objective, I focus on the protecting the interest of refugees or migrants, or politicians have a wider agenda. And this includes winning elections. And this is why politicization comes into play, as Guia was saying before. Then nature is completely different in the political realm than in the research realm. Policy making also produces knowledge through cabinet studies, through consultancy, through international organizations. They are all, I like to say, thinking within the box, thinking in the box of policymaking. Then research is there eventually to think out of the box and to fit into this process the results of this out of the box thinking. And I can give examples if you want later. Research can only be useful, and this is very important, only be useful to the extent that it has its own agenda, own questions, own methods, own answers. And this very often means that their results are not relevant for policy making. This happens. And this is why I say this is not a drama. We have to be modest. We as researchers, we do our work. Researchers have, by definition, a critical approach. And policymakers, they do their work, and often they interact. Actually, think tanks, which is the third modality, think tanks are there to think across the box, to link the through analysis the world of research and policy making. I will refer to them later. I will finalize this first intervention by underlining that the timeline is also very different between research and policy making. Research is by definition a long term endeavor. We have long projects. We have long knowledge production objectives. Policy making is now, at the most until the next election, by definition. And this doesn't mean that there cannot be a dialogue, not at all. It means that they always or very often have difficulties to find a common ground somehow. Still, I think that research can be very useful for policy making over the long term by creating, I always say when people ask me, what is the use of all what you are doing? Are you ever listened to? I say, no, most often I'm not listened to. But actually, overall, in the long term, I'm contributing to create a discourse which does have bearing on policy making over longer term. And I think this is very clear. I remember, for instance, doing a report for the European Parliament on European Union labour migration policy in 2016. Very clearly, in the context of the after-migration crisis, it was hopeless. It was very clear that the European Union and member states wouldn't open borders for legal labour migration at that stage. But actually, the evidence we produced, the discourse we produced, the options that we propose for policy making in the field of legal labor migration have contributed for Germany, France, Spain even, to have a very different approach on legal labor migration a couple or 3 years afterwards. Of course, coronavirus has again changed the setting, and this may not materialize as quickly as it seemed a few weeks ago or a couple of months ago. I will finalize just by making a statement which seems to me very important. Researchers do not know more than policymakers know. They know different things. And this is very important. And policymakers, and I like to say, I will come to this later in the afternoon. I like to say that the experts in policymakers are not researchers, in policymaking are not researchers, are policymakers. Researchers are experts, or they should be experts in research. And so they don't know more, they know different things. And I think this is an important starting point, and then we will discuss in a second round on practices.
Thanks a lot, Iván. I think we are leaving more questions than answering them, and I think that's really good. So Guias, if you have some comments for Iván, then you can be as provocative as him too. So
Thank you. Thank you, Ivan. No, well, I will not be provocative because I agree with what Ivan said in terms of the need of having a precondition for building the nexus, because this nexus is really weak and evanescent. So yes, we really have to prepare it in order to make it happen. And to prepare it, we should consider what Ivan just mentioned. So it is really important, the policy relevance of the topic we choose. That should not be policy driven, but policy relevant. That is extremely different. You were mentioning the need of a government, and in this I would like to hear more from you about the Euro-Mediterranean lack of governance. I would like to listen to you on this. And on the weak position of researchers, yes, you're right. We are the weakest part because they are going as the money for doing what we're doing. So if we criticize too much, maybe we will have a less research fund, who knows. But by the way, we also have the strong position of being the academia and to feed into the discourse. Yes, probably we are not writing straight to the policymakers who he's there in the Ministry of the Interior. Yes, you're right, but we are building discourses and we know how much strong discourses are. Unfortunately, in these times of populism, our discourses are not strong enough, and this make us be stronger and stronger in order to support our takes. And the time is crucial. You're right here again. So I mostly agree with Ivan, and I would like to have time to further talk on this.
Okay, thank you, Guia. Ivan, if you want.
Just on this, well, peculiar Euro-Mediterranean governance setting, just not to talk about lack of governance as Guia did. I think that this is very important when discussing the research policy nexus. Why? Because we don't have Euro-Mediterranean policy making. It is European policy making projected on the Euro-Mediterranean space. And this is very clear, with participation of Southern Mediterranean countries and governments, of course, but it is European policy making. So this has a few implications, and as much for in the field of migration as in other fields. I would say even more so in the field of migration. First implication is that the target of this research policy nexus is by definition European, not Euro-Mediterranean. Second, this also brings, and this is one word that you have used in your framing before, also brings a kind of inbuilt Eurocentrism. I mean, if we are talking, and I have worked with many Southern Mediterranean governments. I'm now a senior fellow in a Moroccan think tank, so I'm close to Southern Mediterranean countries. It's not that I'm not aware, but if the target of this policy nexus is European, if the funding is European, Eurocentrism is built into the Euro-Mediterranean category. You cannot escape that. And for me, this has many implications. So just to conclude, I fully agree, policy relevant shouldn't mean policy driven, just policy oriented maybe, but not policy driven. But in the Euro-Mediterranean space, a lot of the research focused on Euro-Mediterranean topics is policy driven because it is framed also epistemologically into a setting which has been created on the basis of very concrete interests of the European Union. And I say it having indulged and indulging still a lot in this framework. I mean, it's self-criticism more than anything else. But I think that it is very important, and this has to do with funding. We have partners in Southern, but they are not equal partners. They are the funded parts of the projects, always. And it is probably a chance that we are two Europeans talking on migration and Euro-Mediterranean research policy nexus. It is natural that it is so, because we are basically discussing our own policy making. Okay? This is my first stage at this point. Luisa.
And I think we will continue to discuss that now that we move to this second round, because now we know how big is the challenge that we have and how many questions and how actually we can deal with it is the next question, right? So in this second round, I would suggest us to move so precisely to the practice of the research policy nexus. So if we have these huge problem and challenges, and see how or has some suggestions of how it could be actually tackled, something that Guia said herself that she's trying to work on that. So mainly the problems that have been raised about lack of communication, maybe lack of trust between these two spheres. So how to actually bridge and how to make it work. So I had some suggestion of questions that I think you have already started to discuss them. And so maybe we can go deeper into them. For example, how to conciliate in practice these two spheres that have such a different dynamics, priorities, and goals. As Iván said, a researcher is an expert in research, a policymaker is an expert in policy. And here I would add like the extent to which researchers, because we have the figure also of researchers that are activists, and they are planning, like involved in politics too. Maybe it's not the case of everyone, but might be the case. So how different is the when you assume this role and you want to make politics through your research? So this might be also not the case of everyone, but there might be also the case of some. So so in practice, how and when these nexus should be better operationalized, and whom should be targeted, like which actors are we talking about? And maybe we can also reflect upon some things that you already started talking, which is like how to make research useful for policy without damaging its capacity for producing critic and independent knowledge. And you've already started talking about that. And also Iván's mentioned about Eurocentrism, so how Mediterranean migration research is producing knowledge, so how to reflect upon maybe the funding, but also beyond that, something about more the epistemologies of it, and how to avoid, if it's possible, or maybe it's not, the Eurocentrism that governs policy and research. And finally, to which extent should the relation between the two spheres lead to the politicization of research? So how can all these things be separated, united, and in practice, if you have any tips or any things that you yourself have been trying to do in your own work, and the sense of academic freedom, so all these things that you already started talking, and I think it's very interesting to go deeper. So have Iván again, so if you want to continue, and then.
Okay, yes, I will reserve my tips for the last round of conclusions. I will start with some reflections on when to act on the research policy nexus and how to do it, which seem to me relevant. First, we have to have in mind the policy cycle, from analysis of a situation to setting of objectives and priorities, to policy programming, to policy implementation and funding and implementation, to evaluation and back. And why I say that? Because researchers typically cannot intervene in all these phases. They can intervene, of course, in diagnostics and analysis of the situation. They are best placed to do so. They can intervene in the design. I mentioned before, I think the policy objectives have to be defined by policymakers, but they can define in the technical making of the policy on how to reach those objectives. Then they don't have any role until monitoring and evaluation. They don't have a role on implementation. They don't have role on policy programming as such. If they are involved, it's as experts, not as researchers producing knowledge. And I think this is a first framework to take into consideration. Now, how they can enact this, enforce this research policy nexus. I go back again to the World Migration Report of IOM 2020, where they say in migration policy making all ingredients are important. I'm quoting, but the following conditions are required. And they mention 4 requirements, and I will follow this structure later in a few minutes. First requirement is evidence exists and is accessible to policymakers. The issue of accessibility of evidence. Policymakers are motivated to use evidence. Very often they are not motivated. They are even motivated to ignore it. We have examples every day in the media. And when you engage in policymakers, you see it. You very often see that they are not interested, not motivated to use the evidence you are setting on the table. They have their reasons. I'm not questioning that, but it is so. They have to have the capacity to use training, and which is not to be taken for granted. And the policymakers and policymaking bodies should have relationships that facilitate the relevance and use of evidence, the institutional arrangement to make this happen. First, the issue of accessibility. Of course, you have mentioned Guia before, advisory boards or consultative arrangements of any sort. I think that there is a very important element to take into consideration is the level of reaching of accessibility to policymaking. It is more effective to reach just line officers, or it is better to go to the high decision makers. I would say the two are important, but the two require different approaches. And maybe we can discuss a little bit on this later. Then the channels, how we actually channel or how we package the message. Think tanks are experts in that. Media, I would say, if as researchers we manage to have presence in the media, this automatically enhance a lot our capacity to have influence on policymakers. Media is a key instrument or tool for this research policy focus. And in this regard, the use of figures, i.e., you can spend years saying that it is a shame that the difference in mother mortality at delivery between Spain and Morocco is so high. It is 72 women per 100,000 deliveries in Morocco. It is only 5 women die for 100,000 deliveries in Spain. This doesn't mean anything. But if you say that in Morocco there are 2,500 women dying every year that wouldn't die if Morocco had the same rate of mortality than Spain, this makes a difference. This is more than the people dying trying to cross the Gibraltar Strait. And this receives a lot of media coverage. I'm saying that the channels are an important consideration. We can discuss more later. The motivation, and this you have somehow to build into the policy making power game. I remember having to explain to a minister in Ghana why they should invest, the Minister of Employment, why they should invest in a labor market information system. He didn't know what the labor market information system is to start with. He was not, he didn't care at all. But then I said, listen, you have the journal. I have seen the journalists outside when I came in of the BBC and have you an interview? Yes, I have an interview. And are you aware that they are going to ask you about the unemployment rate in Ghana? Well, I hadn't thought about it. And are you aware that you don't know what is the unemployment rate in Ghana? And he said, well, actually, I don't know, so, but I cannot admit it to the press. So, well, this is the use of having a labor market information system. It's just to find the motivation. It is not the labor market information system or knowledge that motivates them. It's just to have a good performance in front of international media. And this is a legitimate a goal for him or her as well. The capacity to use evidence, I think researchers should engage if they want to be policy relevant in training of policy makers at line level. You learn a lot and you learn what is really policy relevant for them. And so it may seem a paradox, but training is very important to increase the capacity of policymakers, but also for researchers to better understand what are the what makes the world move. And then policymakers, researchers, alliances. I will mention one particular case. When I arrived to the Migration Policy Center in Florence in 2013, the director had agreed with the European Commissioner on Migration at the time, Cecile Wellstrom, to launch a kind of campaign on stereotypes on migration. And we produced very quickly, in a matter of 2 weeks, a very bad research piece, which was a very successful policy piece, basically substantiating 8 stereotypes on migration, different ones in Europe. And the commissioner proposed herself to make a public press conference on these stereotypes. And we came everywhere, all over Europe in the press. And this, of course, is has a much bigger impact also on policy making ultimately than 10 research journal articles. And comparative analysis is a basic tool. I mean, policymakers look to each other across countries. So if you can produce good comparative analysis across countries on any particular policy topic, then evidence will be at least looked at. Considered or not, this is a different thing. And just a final thing that seems to me important: who are the actors of this? I have referred before to the level of the actors of research policy nexus, but I will refer an experience. I was in the advisory committee of a framework program 7 project, basically Horizon 2020, the antecessor of Horizon 2020. And in the final workshop of this 3 years and 3 million euros project on Arab youth, we basically were discussing how to bring all the results, the research results of the project to policymakers. And I was listening the whole morning and listening a kind of deprecating, diminishing comments on policymakers, on officers in Brussels, on Brussels, and so on. And I came and I said something which was taken very badly, but I think that I was right. I said, listen, I have met many researchers in life. I work at universities, and I have met many policymakers. And I don't think the rate of idiot people is bigger in any of the two groups. So first thing, not consider policymakers as idiots. They have other priorities, other constraints, but they are not idiots. And they know a lot. They know different things, but they know a lot. Second, they are well-intentioned. It is not that they don't want to implement the findings of researchers. They are genuinely, in most of the cases, interested in improving policy outcomes. But again, they have different interests and different constraints that we researchers have. And they are interested in research outcomes, genuinely interested. They read the it is a myth that they don't read. They read. They don't read everything. They don't read everything that we write, but they read a lot. And they use what they read. And I think that this is an important, I would say, platform to start any research policy nexus undertaking. And I will stop here at this stage.
Yes, thanks, Iván. Guia, if you have some comments for Iván.
Yes, thanks, Iván. Again, you touched upon some crucial points, and again, I agree with you. So the accessibility of evidence is crucial, and this is probably the first step that should be taken when we want to build up a dialogue. The motivation, according to my experience, I saw a lot of motivation in policymakers, actually. And the fact that you were mentioning just at the end of your intervention, the respect that should be paid between the two groups, I think it is there. I've seen sometimes among researchers a kind of frustration because our results have not been heard or listened to, but working in the middle of these two communities of experts, again, I saw that the respect, the reciprocate respect is there. And it is crucial because when people need to talk from different perspectives, they have to start with respecting each other and respecting each other's expertise. Because the first things when I enter a room where a working session on specific topics on migration, gathering around the table policymakers and researcher is what can I learn today? Okay, what can I say, but what can I learn? Because this is extremely important. Also the attitude to listen to the others. And here comes the motivation and the capacity to use the evidence. If I am able to listen, and usually policymakers are best listeners than researchers because they are more eager to get something useful for them. Not all, but in general, I had this impression. So thanks for structuring this practical articulation, and I'm going to touch upon it in my next talk on practices. Tell me more about the communication side, because we as researchers are not professional communicators, but we need to be better in doing that. And so your experience, the experience you mentioned about the small researcher who had a huge media coverage, we also had some kind of experience, but how do you deal as a researcher with these communication needs that we have?
Well, thank you for these comments. And honestly, I think communication is overvalued today, frankly. And I don't think as researchers, even researchers wanting to have a bearing on policy making, we should care too much about communication. This is, I mean, I really think that we are all coming into marketers of something, politicians and researchers. And my experience is that if you have policy relevant results of your research, and you have to make sure that you have some way of accessibility. I mean, that you are not irrelevant because you are not present in the policy making fora. But I don't think, I mean, all this trend now to write a lot of policy briefs, to write 3 pages, I think that this is the role of other actors, think tanks probably, communication or cabinets of politicians, but not necessarily of researchers as such. In terms of communication, I think, I mentioned it before, media is very important. This is, yes. And of course, this already requires some adaptation of your formats, at least. And I would say figures somehow, I mean, having the message in a way that it's very easy to grasp for any audience. And migration rate is not easy. I mean, I would refer to the IOM communication strategy on the number of dead people across the Mediterranean and worldwide, the Missing Migrants Project. I think this is a very, very good example of that. With very limited resources, very limited. I know the team in Berlin doing it, and they have managed to be quoted every time and taken into account in policy making every time. And I think that's a good example. It is not exactly research. This is also clear. It is some way of research, but they are not professional researchers as such. But I think it's the power of your message and taking into account this motivation, accessibility, and communication ideas I shared before. But I wouldn't worry too much about the format. I mean, this is not a role. This is how I see it. But I know that I go against the tide of the times on this.
Okay.
Thanks, Iván. Now I'll give the floor to Guia to have her presentation on this practice of Research Nexus, and maybe tell more about her experience so far doing that.
Yes, thank you, Luisa. So yes, this is exactly what I'm going to do. So according to my personal experience, I can bring here two different examples of how the research policy nexus can happen. The first example is the KING project, the Knowledge for Integration Governance, funded by the European Commission, DG Home Affairs, under the European Integration Fund in 2013 and 15. And the second one is the ReSOMA project, Research Social Platform on Migration and Asylum. This is again funded by the European Commission, DG Research, under the H2020 program in 2018 and 2020. So these were both were two experiences I had in trying to build up this policy dialogue. So during the KING experience, I was coordinating 46 researchers from all over Europe, coming from different disciplines, social scientists, administrative officers, demographers, political scientists, many, who produced 1,200 pages of academic results on migrants integration. So the area was quite narrow at that time. And you're right, even policymakers would like to read, but not 1,200 pages, absolutely. So our effort that time was to reduce the contents in order to make them readable. And here I'm talking about the accessibility you were mentioned before. How can we make it accessible for those who may are interested to read it and to know what we're doing? So we had at the time the good idea of to take the common basic principles of integration. That are these 11 principles shared by at the European level by all the policymakers, because those principles are those where the funds come into the course of proposal. So it is a frame that is really well known, and we use it to operationalize our results. So according to the common basic principles, a well-known frame for policymakers, we reduced our context to 90 pages. And that 90 pages were already a lot, but was taken as the background note of a ministerial conference of ministers on integration. That was the 5th ministerial conference on integration under the Italian presidency of the European Union. So thanks to the lucky time we had at that moment of the interest on integration issues and on the fact that we were ready with the contents and we had the common basic principles to operationalize it, we had a possibility to bring our contents to the table, to the round table of those ministers that were in charge at that time for migration issues. And at the end of the one-day debating on our results, they signed 3 pages. Okay, so we had 1,200, and then they signed 3 pages. Well, from a researcher point of view, of course, this is a little bit frustrating because you see all the contents that are coming apart, that are falling down. But at the end, we made the exercise, and the dialogue was there, and the accessibility of the result was granted, and we've been heard. And they were using it, practically using it, because they were reading, they were canceling, they were using our papers. So it was really something very good at that time. And at that time, it was mainly a translation exercise. We just translate what we had in order to make it readable too. With ReSOMA, but the research policy nexus was there. So this is a concrete example. With ReSOMA, we had a different exercise. The consortium was completely different because in ReSOMA we had think tanks, European think tanks, we had universities, but mostly we had the social platforms partners. Having ECRE, having PICUM, having Eurocities and social platform, we had among the consortium of this project the representative of all those NGOs working with migrants on asylum and refugees, ECRE, on undocumented migrants, PICUM, on the migration issue at the local level with Eurocities, and the social inclusion with social platforms. So there we have a more complex nexus. It was not only research policy, but it was research social policy dialogue. And we had the ambition to pick up and choose those topics who were more policy relevant, exactly in the moment that we are going to address them. So for each of the 2 years, we had this selection of a high prioritized topic from a policy point of view. Just for giving you an example, it was the crackdown on NGOs supporting migrants and refugees. It was the implementation of the Global Compact on Migration, the inclusion on undocumented migrants, the use of detention in the receiving, the SARS and disembarkation. All of the topics we choose were extremely hot at the moment. And we were quite quickly collecting evidence on available policy options in order to give to the policymakers the opportunity to have some really, in that case, with only policy brief. It was not empirical research. It was not a really genuine research project. It was a CSA, so we were just collecting what was existing. And in doing that, we had to start or feed into an ongoing consultation process, bringing together experts for these 3 different communities. Again, academia, civil society stakeholders, and policymakers. And most of our working session was held in Brussels, and we organized these afternoons with clear rules. All the meetings were under the Chatham rules, meaning that no social media were allowed. There was a kind of attention to build the confidence needed for let people talking, because from policymakers' side, sometimes they have things to say, but they don't, because they don't feel comfortable because they represent institutions, so they are in a quite difficult position. But if you arrange things in a way that they are comfortable, then the working session comes very, very in a fruitful way. And we had a very good experience that even those people who had busy agenda and not time to waste, they were happy. They were extremely happy to be around the table with experts on the same very narrow issue, but with different perspective, with different interests, with different takes on the very same topic. And this can work very well. And I think there is the need. We saw how how lively was the discussion there. And from a research point of view, being there, listening to what people were saying, it was extremely interesting because they know the reality. The civil society stakeholders knows exactly what migrants' needs are, what the advocacy statements are, and the policymakers, of course, can give the other piece of this reality. Is extremely interesting. But of course, for having that happen, you have to provide the right contents in the right form, in the right format, and have also the right format for the meeting. It's not easy, but when it happens, it's extremely fruitful. And so here, my suggestion is that if we are able to enlarge this nexus, taking into account also the civil society stakeholder, the social partners, the dialogue can happen in a better way. And we are also more, let's say, less weak as researchers, because we keep on doing what we are supposed to do, research, and the other ones can more advocate, can more deal with this communication task to make the results known. And this was extremely successful in the case of the criminalization of NGOs, because we started in 2015 working on these topics. And when it came in the 2019 that the harbor were locked down in Italy, but not only, and the crisis was there, we were ready at that time with a list of criminalized people who were criminalized because they were acting out of solidarity and humanity in saving lives. And that was extremely rewarding from our perspective. And I have also to mention the fact that thanks to Ricardo Zapata, although ReSOMA ended in last March, we had a possibility to make it sustainable within the MISCOE network, because MISCOE found the interest to support this dialogue with the social partner stakeholders. So thank you, Ricardo. Maybe there for helping me in letting this happen, and hopefully this dialogue, this triangle dialogue, will keep on in the next future, having hopefully some good goals. Thank you.
Thanks a lot, Guia. Ivan, if you have some comments also on this.
2 points. One which is a very far-reaching point, and I want to hear your insight into that. I mean, you have chosen and described in a very interesting way your experience with 2 specific EU-funded projects, and basically the examples of research policy nexus you have given are European level policy making, which is of course very relevant. But I would say this is the easy part because it is very structured somehow. I mean, it is built into the nature of research funded by EU funds. My experience is that it is much easier to operationalize policy or research policy nexus at European level and at regional level than at national level, than at member state level. And this is particularly important in the field of migration, because migration policy making is basically at national level. So I would like to know whether this is your experience as well. In my experience, it is relatively easy at local, regional level, at national level, at European level, but very difficult where actual policy making power lies, and even more difficult in countries of origin or transit, close to impossible with Moroccan government, with Egyptian government, with Tunisian government. And I think this is a very relevant insight into the discussion we are having. And the other question is just, again, a provocative statement. Maybe, I mean, you have the 2 strategies that you have described for the 2 projects are, one is digesting and the other one is selecting. Digest and somehow translate. You have used the word translate research findings and select what is more policy relevant. My question is, should that be the work of researchers? Maybe not. Maybe not. Maybe yes, maybe not. Maybe we shouldn't translate. I mean, maybe we should aspire for policymakers to learn the language of researchers as well, if they are interested. If they are not interested, sorry, we go our way. And the same for selection. Maybe we should let policymakers to select what is relevant for them and not pre-packaging it, pre-apporter policy issues. This is just a provocative alternative statement, but I think that it is relevant in our discussion as well. Yeah, thank you.
Thank you, Iván.
Thank you for your interesting question. The national level, the regional level. Yes, of course, I had experience. And it's not that easy as it can be at a European level, absolutely. So I had the experience of participating. At that time, I was not a senior researcher, so I was just participating in the research team for a big research funded by at the national level. And yes, at the end, not all results were allowed to be published, for instance. So that time was another kind of frustration. And I have to admit that when you move to the European level, things are more fair, indeed. And probably this is the reason why I insist on working at that level, although it will be necessary working also the national and on the regional level. The ISMU Foundation had the funding from the region for almost 20 years for running the observatory on integration. But then the funded cut has been reduced more when the Lega Party was there. So, of course, there are some evident and also implicit constraints that are there. Yes, you're right. And I don't have the huge experience you have with the southern part of the Mediterranean government. But what I have just, my the last thing I've written was a report on Senegal, on the labor market in Senegal, in order to reduce migration and see how the employability of youth can work. So I'm just into this new exercise for me. And you were saying about translating and selecting, and you were asking if we are supposed to do that kind of job. I'm not a pure researcher, of course. I am always in the middle, and I am with the pro and cons of being constantly in the middle. You are in and out academia, and you are in and out funded projects. So this is what happened to me. So this is my professionality is built on this, and so this is my job. But this is not the job of researchers, and most of the time, researchers doesn't like to spend their time in translating, in trying to communicate or organizing this kind of meetings. It's another piece of cake. It's another job. You're right. And but there are space for it. And if now in the audience we are having students, please consider that there is a space, there is room here for new expertise, for people who want to work in these quite fragmented piece in between the research and the policy makers and the civil society stakeholders. And it is extremely interesting because what I am learning, it's a lot, because you are always challenging yourself between the different perspectives. So it's really funny. It's a funny job. It's not a research job, but it's a funny.
So we started by saying that experts and researchers are not the same, and now we have invented a new profession, which is the research policy nexus mediator.
Yeah.
Why not? Yes, and just to conclude, you were provoking about the selection we had within ReSOMA about these topics. Well, it is not a pre-packed menu, but actually it was done, even that starting part, with the ongoing consultation process, because we were asking policymakers to tell us, to comment on our proposal. We started from 20 and we reduced it to 9 and plus 9. So in that way, we start building the trust with them regarding what we were doing. Because also policymakers doesn't like to have this top-down project from the academia, from the ivory tower. They would like to know what's going on, and sometimes they are really even worried when we are too close to their field, because they feel the pressure. So we just start including them in this process, and we selected some topics that were in the EU agenda, and some other that are only emergent needs, because of course not everything can be. But starting since the beginning in building the relation is extremely important if you want to end with some results. Yeah.
Thank you. Thanks a lot. I think these 2 rounds were very productive, but we are running out of time already. It has been an hour and a half already, but it was very entertaining. So now I would invite you to some conclusion round, if it's okay, and then we can open the floor for some questions. I have a lot too, so I hope I can also make some. So I would just invite you to give us some final reflections. I won't give many. I have some questions that I already gave to you, but please feel free to include something that you think it should be relevant or you didn't have the time to say. So if you want to give us some final do's and don'ts and the golden rules of these as maybe research policy mediators, as you defined, and also maybe some advice for professionals on either side. Maybe today we have mostly researchers, but there might be some policymakers hearing us as well. Considering more like the regional prospect of what you're saying, just a reflection about if you think we are in a good path in the region, that if we have advanced towards a more fruitful relation or not, and or if there are more initiatives on these sense. And maybe some final reflections about the ethical implications of these research policy nexus. And I think we have touched upon many of these reflections. For example, if we should take for granted that the policy impact of research is necessarily and always good, and even taking into consideration that expert knowledge. And I think you mentioned that at the beginning, I don't remember if it was Guia or Iván, that they can either inform policy, but they can also legitimize political interventions that might not be of interest of everyone. And I have some other questions, but maybe if I have time, I'll ask them afterwards. So I'll give you 5 minutes. Maybe you can start with Guia and then with Iván, and you can go just. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Well, yes, I'm a little bit puzzled at this time, but I try to start with the pros and cons, or some tips. Well, I just recall what I have already said. There is a need of full respect of the other perspective, and the main goal should be building a genuine reflexivity process. Because if we are able to build a reflexivity process when we make ourselves being challenged by other perspective, there we can grow a little. And there's a lot of need that we enlarge our perspective from every side. I mean, not only in the policymaker side, but also in the research. So let us being challenged by the others, by other experts, of course. And another tip is that if we build this dialogue on very narrowed issues, it is easier. Because unless we remain on the broad themes or general assumptions, people are not comfortable with the discussion, And there's a kind of worries about where we'll be led to talk. So if the agenda is concrete and extremely narrow, things happen easier, and people are more, it's more possible that they will join this dialogue, and the dialogue should be prepared again. So this is my really practicalities, because this is what I have been experiencing, and probably we should be more brave and try to do this again and again at the national level too. Who knows? Probably with the civil society stakeholders, and enhancing this triangle also locally and not only at the European level. So yes, this is mainly my point.
Thank you, Guia. Ivan?
Okay, I will go from some practicalities to some principles, actually, for 3 principles and a warning, a caveat at the end. First principle, I already mentioned at the beginning, but I think it is really important, is the prevalence of policy in this research policy nexus. Researchers are, of course, free to pick their research theme, approach, perspective, and to reach whichever conclusions they come to. But policymakers and politicians are totally free to decide what is relevant for them and for policy making. And there is no blame there. There is only different constraints, different interests, and different settings. And if you don't accept that, better don't engage into influencing policy from a research position. Second principle is relevance. I mean, just to put it very simple, if they don't read you, if you are not read, is that you are not relevant. It's simply as that. And we should be modest to know it. It is not their fault. It is our fault in terms of policy relevance, not maybe of research relevance as such. And then a very important point related in particular to the issue of migration, which is the hierarchy of knowledge. The only justification of researchers in this research policy nexus is their knowledge, the robustness of the knowledge and evidence they are able to produce. And migration is a very complex issue with many different topics, but in academic world, it is usually only a discipline. I mean, so there is a mismatch there between the complexity of policymaking and the simplicity of discipline categorization of migration, and this has some risks. You cannot possibly produce policy-relevant evidence on refugees, on countries of origin, on labor market integration of refugees, on integration policies, on the many topics related to migration. You have to focus and limit yourself to where you can genuinely produce new knowledge and solid evidence. And this is a very frequent risk incurred by researchers in migration studies, is that they consider that because there is one migration department, not even actually one migration discipline, then this entitles them to make policy recommendations on any migration-related issue. And the final caveat is actually there is a trade-off to engage into policy-relevant research. Actually, when you do that, you are losing some of your, very often, of the robustness of your research as such. I mean, you have mentioned it from 1,200 pages to 3 pages. But also, methodologically, if you want to be policy relevant, you probably have more difficulties to be research relevant. To be so we have to be aware of that. And also that engaging into policy influence somehow has a cost in academic life as well. I mean, in many senses. I mean, it is, I don't know many cases of people who are very much considered a part of the top, of course, but we are very much considered in policy making terms, and which at the same time they are outstanding scholars, having a lot of citations, a lot of articles, publications, and so on. So this is a personal choice somehow. In my case, my personal choice was always that if my research is not policy relevant, I don't want to do it. That's simple. But it is also very legitimate to engage into research just because you want to know more about a particular topic or because you want to make a brilliant academic career. This is very legitimate goals as well. But probably they are not fully compatible with each other. They are partly compatible with each other, but not fully. And I with this warning, I would like to close my conclusions because it is not as easy as it looks. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ivan and Guia. I think there has been a lot of topics and a lot of things that we've said and has been very fruitful. So now I'd like to invite the audience for some questions, and then we can continue the discussion. So for those who want, you have the option to type your question, and then we can organize some rounds of questions. While we wait, I can start if I can, I think, just because I have just one question. Maybe it's not, it doesn't make a lot of sense, but I'll try to formulate it. Because we are talking a lot about and taking for granted that there is a bridge that can be crossed between research and policy, right? And I don't know that if we're talking about the Mediterranean region, which was the idea, I'm thinking about the places where this is not possible, because I don't know the extent to which the Egyptian government is willing to sit with their researchers to listen. So I'm trying to think about what happens there, right? Because we're trying to separate, okay, the researcher is an expert in research and the policymaker is an expert in policy, and the thing doesn't match, but maybe we're talking that from our comfortable position of being researchers in a certain in a certain context, which is not the case for other researchers, and they might be have to become more implicated or more be more do more advocacy, and these fields might not be as separated. I don't know if you have any thoughts on that, on how do you think it works, and what would be our role as researcher from maybe a more comfortable positions of, I don't know, it's difficult, maybe I'm not expressing, but it's like I'm intrigued by how these might work in different contexts where the academic freedom might not be as equal as in Europe.
May I start maybe? I think this is a very relevant issue, Luisa, and this of course refers back to the political nature of regimes in different countries. I think, I mean, all governments do policies, and all policies use some way knowledge, which whether research generated or no. And this is why I said before, no, research policy nexus is not everything that relates policymakers to researchers. You have
Yes.
Organic intellectuals as well. In Egypt, in every country, you have them. And they are researchers. But I wouldn't speak of research policy nexus first. I think just two quick points on this. First, I don't think that the Euro-Mediterranean as such space allows for this interaction with Southern Mediterranean governments, because this is very much, I mentioned it before, European construct. Second, I think that the question that you have put leads to a very clear conclusion, is that research policy nexus can only work, let's say, functionally in a democratic context. In an authoritarian context, it is, I mean, many of the issues that we have mentioned, Guia was mentioning freedom of expression, and so on. I mean, because it is not only a problem of academic freedom, it's a problem of freedom of expression to start with. Okay, so absolutely, this is a key issue. My last point is that we as European researchers have a responsibility there, because we have it much easier here in Europe, but also in those countries. I have a long experience in Tunisia for 10 years before the revolution and after the revolution. And I could do many things in Tunisia with some limitations, with some constraints, but without physical danger for me that other researchers, national researchers couldn't afford, very clearly. And we have the responsibility to push the limits of what is possible, well, just using our privileges as best, and not compromising our academic freedom and freedom of expression, the two things. In some cases, in some moments, this is simply not possible. This is also very clear. But there are many cases in the Mediterranean, but this is much more nuanced, where there are some margin of maneuver.
Thanks, Iván.
I will follow up what Iván was saying, considering also that nowadays the Mediterranean area, it's not integrated at all. I mean, we had better times, not that far in the past, where this kind of possibility had more potentialities. But nowadays, the situation is so dramatic that it is. I don't think that there are the premises to have this happening in a short time. We have to work for letting this happen in the future, but being realistic, I say extremely difficult because of this, how can I say, overpower of Europe. We are not peers. We are not peers at all. And when before Iván was mentioning the Eurocentrism, I was recalling on the fact that I was joining the EuroMed network. That was a network of cities from the countries around the Mediterranean, put in place by the metropolis. And I'm talking about more than 15 years ago. And at that time, the meeting was that the Europeans were on the table and the southern partners were in the audience. And when our Duncan, the Secretary General of Metropolis, came into the room and say, "Hey, but what you're doing, please change the setting. This is crazy." So we realized at that time, I was not on the table talking to the audience, the North talking to the South, but then we realized how awkward was the situation. In fact, they were not talking because they were not supposed to do because of the setting. So at that time, I realized how deep is and how we are blind to see this kind of mechanism that we play constantly. So we are facing different difficulties, those who even mentioned, and our implicit ethnocentrism, and also the fact that from a political point of view, it is extremely difficult now to have a comfortable dialogue with them. It is almost impossible, I'm afraid to say so.
Thank you a lot. We have one question here. I don't know if you can see it, but I'll read it because I don't know how it works. But about this subject, we should consider two important actors besides politicians and researchers. And I think this is added also to the civil society. And the person mentions is the media and the citizens. So media and citizens' views could be against researchers' outputs, for example, human rights and security issues. So how policymakers, politicians can balance between these contradictory issues, since they need citizens' vote in these next elections. And I think you've mentioned a little bit about these the different interests, right? And Iván was mentioned that, but if you want to go deeper on the interests, then I think it goes on this line.
May I start?
Yes, of course.
Okay, so yes, it is a good question. Of course, when you talk about citizenship, well, if you want the dialogue to happen, you have to prepare it. So it's better to have some representative of the citizen. It is important that every perspective can be heard, but it should be done not in a spontaneous way. Because those people who have, I mean, both researchers and policymakers that have quite high level of professionality should be brought around the table with clear mission, with clear goals to be achieved. So it is important to have also the citizens' voice, but should be mediated by those who have the right way to do that. I mean, and this was the reason why we choose to have in our consortium with ReSOMA the most important representative of the NGOs. You can't just take one NGOs and bringing it to the table, talking to the policymakers, because probably you will provoke a fight. So you have to choose the right people in order to make this happen, because it is really delicate. Those are delicate situations, and you can, in a few minutes, you can ruin what you have been working on since months or years. So it's something that really has to be prepared with a lot of careful.
I have two reactions to this. One is very short on media. I think they are basically a very good tool and channel for leveraging influence on policymakers. You can be very good researchers doing a lot of very interesting research, and you publish a short article in a national newspaper with very little content actually, and then automatically you are considered part of the public debate, which is well, it's a good opportunity, I would say. On the second issue, I think that I fully agree with Guia's comments, but I think that it brings us to the issue you raised before, Luisa, of researchers and activists. Actually, I think this is very interesting. I think that there are two different categories. Activists mobilize or aim to mobilize public opinion. Researchers aim to produce evidence, but a way of mobilizing public opinion is evidence as well, of course. And the ultimate goal of activists is to influence policy making as well. So I would say that rather than citizens as category, in the process of implementing the research policy nexus, it is better to have activists with the caveats that we mentioned, but to have activists rather than citizens as such. The organized movements in the society, NGOs, is a category which is much more useful in the policy research policy nexus framework than citizenship as such, I would say.
Thanks a lot. We don't have other questions, so if anyone has more questions. I cannot see the participants either, but if you have for each other, you can also. I had just one, maybe just a small one, because when you mentioned the different levels of governance and how these research policy nexus work differently, I was wondering if at the local level it happens the same, right? If it's just like the most problematic might be the national one, but also again in the local level we will also able to be more effective, maybe, or from your experience, if you think it happens the same, or how
in my experience, it happens more easily at the local or regional level than at the national level. Then you have variations depending on many issues, of course, but it is also proximity plays a role there. And I will give, personal examples. If I have worked in policy making frameworks as a researcher in 30 occasions throughout my life, well, probably 20 have been at EU level, and 8 at local, regional level, and very few at national level, including in Spain. I'm living in Madrid, and I have had some, I have been solicited sometimes in the framework, for instance, of the Real Instituto Elcano think tank, really policy making exercises. But this has happened much more with the governments of Andalusia, of Catalonia, even regional governments in Italy, even if I'm based in Madrid.
Yeah, do you have a...
For me, it's the same. I mean, yes, the national level is definitely the most difficult one. Also, in terms of having the possibility to yes, to being heard. I don't know why, actually, because I've been working with the national level when different parties were at the power. So it was not only, it was not because of the party. It is probably, it can be also linked to the, they are quite overwhelmed by bureaucratical issues. And so they are so, usually we are told that researchers are slow. Well, the national level is super slow. And it is probably the motivation is not high there, and also the fact that they are always committed with a lot of bureaucrats. So this is really make the case that those who are there are more technicians dealing with procedures instead of people that have to decide policies. And the policies are decided on very political level that in my case was too high to be reached. So the middle level, if you talk to a policy officer, a head of unit at the European Union, you have a person who is really interested there to know more, to understand and to see. If you talk at the same level, at the national level, you have another kind of person. Completely different professionality. Those are people overwhelmed by papers for making procedures run. So it is more a systematic issue instead of a personal one. But this should be studied. I'm not an expert on this, but it is the most difficult level. It's a national one, yes.
And this is particularly serious issue in the field of migration, where policy-making power lies largely at national level, so at the national states.
Yeah, the local level is better, definitely better. Yeah.
Thanks a lot. We have 2 more questions, and one is about. Do you have any experience, it's from one member from GRITIM, do you have any experience working with refugees and migrants and promoting their participation in policy debates? I wonder in practice, for example, when you organize a workshop to bring together both refugees or other participants of the research and local politicians, how do you facilitate the conversation in a way that it promotes interaction and leads to concrete action plans that would have an impact on policy? I think it's again about the other actors that might be at the same time objects of research or subjects of research.
This is a very important point for me, and actually, since now, I've experienced this kind of possibility of migrant voice being heard only concretely in the European Migration Forum, where there are those migrant representative or refugees elected by the forum, bringing some clear statement to a bigger audience, and that work. But usually, as it is the situation in Italy, we are quite far from that. And if the question comes from a person who lives in Britain, they are much more advanced because of the history, because of everything. But here we are quite far from that. And it is very difficult for migrants to be heard. But I would take the opportunity to mention that today in Italy is the day of the first strike of seasonal workers in the agriculture system. And this has been made by Abubakar Soumaro, which is an incredibly high-level migrant from Cameroon who can talk Italian much better than a politician can do, actually. And he is put himself at the head of this movement of invisible people. So we have some cases as Abubakar Soumaro, and please go to see his Twitter account because he's extremely powerful and interesting. He's giving the voices to migrants, speaking perfect Italian with a very high level rhetoric, positive rhetoric. But generally speaking, migrants are completely absent in our national local debate.
Thank you. Ivan, do you have?
Yes, very quickly. I think that we have to distinguish production of knowledge and research policy nexus. In order to produce knowledge on any phenomenon, you need to approach the actors of this phenomenon. And the person making the question referred to refugees, but this applies to all others. So they are a key link in the knowledge production chain. I don't think necessarily that bringing in citizens or actors into the process of translating this research finding into policy-making relevant evidence is necessary. It can be useful in some context, but it is not necessary in all contexts. Actually, the evidence, just to be clear, the evidence produced, the policy-relevant evidence can be primary evidence, I mean, what you collect when you do field work, or not. I mean, a good bibliographical review of research on a certain topic or causal relation can be a fantastic policy-relevant evidence. Evidence is in the research policy nexus. Evidence is not primary evidence, not requires, it may or may not require field work. It can be just secondary analysis of other people's research. And this is very valuable evidence for policymaking, even if it is not anything more than a bibliographical research, review for in a research setting. Okay, so I think this is important. So to answer the question is yes, policymakers are sensitive to testimonies of direct beneficiaries or affected of any policies, but this is only one among many tools that you can use for promoting research policy nexus.
And thank you. And now we have a final question from Ricardo Zapata, and I think it's very connected to this idea of evidence. So his question goes, and he would like to request to dig into the evidence-based movement, which is key in this nexus. The premise is that researchers provide evidences that may help to improve governance, but the reality is far from the theoretical premise. Coronavirus show us how difficult it is to construct evidence within uncertain contexts, and also how many different evidence can lead to many different political decisions. So he would like to know more critical thinking of this movement containing these research and policy nexus. So maybe we're running out of time, maybe these to finalize with these reflection about the evidence.
If I may, I will be, thank you, Ricard. I will be quick on this. Well, you are mentioning the coronavirus, and okay, this is something completely new. So meaning that also experts now are fighting one another because no one exactly knows what we're dealing with. So only the time will give the answers to say which expert was right or not. But in our domain, in the migration issue, we had an enormous proliferation of migration studies. There's a lot of knowledge. And when we talk about migrant inclusion, mobility of people, we're not talking about astrophysics. It's not that difficult. It is just something that should be accepted or not. It's more based on values and on political interest and on also the propaganda made by certain politicians. But it's not that difficult as what we are facing with the coronavirus. So I think that with the coronavirus, it is extremely difficult and it is too early to rely completely on experts on migration. The time are there. We know what we should do, but the problem is that we don't want, probably. And providing evidence, and not only evidence, but also the good reasons for doing something. And that is something, and this is to link to what Iván was saying at the beginning. This is more a research commitment to provide the society with the good reason for doing something, not only the evidence that can be too cold, but the good reasons are warmer.
Thank you, Guia.
I think this question comes back to the issue we discussed. Actually, this was the first issue raised by Guia in her very first presentation on the bidirectionality of the research policy nexus. It goes into the two directions. Then, indeed, it is very often not the case that researchers produce policy-relevant evidence or arguments, as you were saying. This can be because research is not good, or because it is very good but not policy relevant. And I mean, this is one part of the issue. The other part, of course, is that policymakers, and in particular politicians, can use this, as we also was saying, can use this evidence or good reasons, arguments in many different ways. They can use it for improving policymaking, for legitimating, for policymaking, for legitimizing policy which is already made and decided, or even for manipulating policy relevant actors, which is very often the case in the field of migration in particular. As far as COVID-19 crisis is concerned, I agree, it is too early. I mean, basically, the honest researchers' approach should be, we don't know. I mean, there is no time to draw very big conclusions. Then researchers are also experts because of their past work. So they cannot provide evidence but they can provide informed opinion and expert opinion. And as such, it is, of course, very legitimate and even, I would say, a public responsibility to do it. But as such, we are not talking as much about the research policy nexus, but researcher policy nexus, because it is the researchers as experts which are demanded in this context, rather than evidence produced by research for which no one of us has had the time or the conditions, because we are locked down, if you don't remember.
Yeah. Okay, I think we've
Still.
yeah, some of us
Barcelona as
still
well.
are. Yes, I think we've it's nice topic to conclude. I think we've have covered many things, and maybe we have more questions than. But I always say it's better, like, to have more questions than answers sometimes. I would like to thank you, Guia and Iván, for sharing your insights and experience with us, and I hope we can continue this dialogue somehow, because I think it's very, very important. And thank you all the participants from here and YouTube for being here. And I hope you can leave lockdown soon and enjoy. Thank you a lot, Iván and Guia.
Thank you, Luisa, for organizing this and sharing. Thank you very
Thank you. It was nice.
much.
Thank you.
Bye.
Bye.